I knew that necklace would ruin my life the moment he looked at it. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of the restaurant, a quiet rhythm that almost drowned out the clinking of silverware and low conversations drifting through the dimly lit dining room. And I kept my head down as I balanced a tray of drinks, moving carefully between tables like I always did during the late shift, unnoticed, invisible, safe, my fingers brushing lightly against the necklace resting against my collarbone. A habit I had never been able to break, not since I was a kid, not since it became the only thing I had that felt like it belonged to someone who once cared about me, even if I couldn't fully remember why. And everything was normal until the front doors opened and the entire room changed without a single word being spoken. Because people like him didn't need introductions, they didn't need announcements. Their presence alone bent the air, slowed the room, made people straighten in their seats and lower their voices without understanding why, and I felt it before I saw him. That shift, that pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. And when I finally looked up, I wished I hadn't, because he was already looking at me, not in the casual way customers sometimes did, not curious or distracted, but focused, sharp, like he had already decided I mattered before I even knew who he was. And I dropped my gaze immediately, telling myself to breathe, to move, to keep working, because men like that didn't notice girls like me, except he did. I felt it with every step I took, his attention following me across the room, quiet but undeniable, until my hand trembled just enough to make the ice in the glasses shift, and I cursed myself under my breath, forcing a steady pace as I approached a table near the back, placing each drink down with care, pretending the world hadn't tilted, pretending I didn't feel watched. But it didn't work. Nothing worked, because seconds later, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, each one louder than the last in my head. And before I could turn, before I could prepare, his voice cut through the noise, low and controlled, but carrying something underneath that made my chest tighten. Don't move. And I froze, not because I had to, but because something in me knew I should. And then his hand appeared in my peripheral vision, not touching me, just close enough that I could feel the heat of it, as his gaze dropped to my neck, and the air between us shifted again, heavier this time, sharper, like something fragile had just cracked open. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and I didn't need to ask what he meant, my fingers instinctively rising to the necklace, gripping it as if that could somehow hide it from him, as if that could undo whatever had already started. "It's just mine," I said quickly, too quickly, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. And that's when he looked at me properly, really looked at me, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to pull something out of me I didn't even know I had. And for a second, just 1 second, I saw something break through his composure, something that didn't belong to a man who controlled everything around him, something almost human, almost lost, before it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by something colder, something certain. And when he spoke again, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because the weight of it pressed into me anyway. "That necklace belonged to my wife," he said, each word precise, final, and my heart stopped, not because of what he said, but because of how sure he was, like there was no version of this where he could be wrong. And that was the moment I realized the truth wasn't going to stay buried anymore, no matter how badly I wanted it to. I should have denied it harder, faster, something more convincing than the weak excuse that barely left my lips. Because the way his eyes narrowed told me he had already dismissed my answer before I finished speaking, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he could have said out loud, stretching between us while the rest of the restaurant slowly came back to life around us. Conversations resuming in cautious tones, silverware clinking again like nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me, because he did not move, did not step back, did not look away. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I had just become the center of something I did not understand and could not escape. "Who gave it to you?" he asked again, softer this time, but sharper, like he was carving the truth out of the air between us. And I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the necklace as if it could anchor me, as if it could remind me of the version of this story I had always told myself, the simple one, the safe one, the one where it was just an old piece of jewelry I had owned for as long as I could remember. Nothing more, nothing dangerous, nothing worth noticing. "I told you," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. It has always been mine. And for a moment, I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe he would decide I was not worth the trouble. Maybe he would walk away and let the night continue like it was supposed to. But instead he exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried something colder beneath it, something final. And then he stepped back, just one step, but it felt like the air rushed back into my lungs all at once. And without another word, he turned and walked away, his presence pulling the room's attention with him like a current, leaving me standing there with shaking hands and a heart that refused to slow down. And I told myself it was over, that whatever that moment was had passed, that I could finish my shift and go home and pretend none of this had happened. But deep down I knew that was not how men like him worked, and I was right, because less than 10 minutes later my manager appeared at my side with a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "Lily," he said quietly, "the gentleman who just left asked for your full name." And the words hit me harder than I expected, a cold weight settling in my stomach as I shook my head immediately. "You cannot give that out," I said, but he looked uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze. "He did not ask," he replied, "and I already told him." And that was the moment the night truly broke, because it was not about a necklace anymore. It was about being seen, being known, being found, and I finished the rest of my shift on autopilot, barely hearing the orders, barely feeling my own movements as I carried trays and cleared tables, my mind replaying every second of that encounter, every word, every look, until it felt like I had been standing in front of him for hours instead of minutes. And when my shift finally ended and I stepped out into the cool night air, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. And for a brief moment, I let myself believe I was alone again, that I had made it through, that I could walk the 3 blocks to my apartment and lock the door behind me and leave this version of my life outside. But as I reached the corner and turned onto my street, I saw the car, black, still, parked under a flickering light like it had been waiting there longer than it should have, and I slowed without meaning to, my pulse picking up as the engine hummed quietly, not off, not leaving, just waiting, and I knew without needing to see inside that he had not let it go, that he had not walked away, and that whatever truth I had tried to keep buried was already catching up to me. I should have kept walking, kept my head down, pretended I did not see the car, but something in me slowed anyway, like my body already knew running would not change anything. And the closer I got, the clearer it became that this was not coincidence, not someone idling for a late-night call or waiting for a friend. The engine was too steady, too intentional. And when I was about 10 feet away, the driver's side door opened without hesitation, like he had been watching my every step, timing it. And he stepped out into the dim light as if the street belonged to him the same way the restaurant had, the same quiet authority, the same controlled presence that made everything else feel smaller. And for a second neither of us spoke, the distance between us filled with the hum of the engine and the faint drip of water from the streetlights above. And I told myself to say something, to break it, to pretend this was normal. But the words did not come fast enough. "You should not have followed me," I said finally, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt, which almost surprised me. But his expression did not change, not anger, not apology, just that same focus, like he had already decided how this was going to go. "I did not follow you," he replied, his tone even, almost calm. I waited, and that was somehow worse, because waiting meant intention, meant patience, meant he had not reacted out of impulse back at the restaurant. He had chosen this, planned it, and my grip tightened around the strap of my bag as I glanced past him at the car, noticing for the first time that the windows were too dark to see inside, that I could not tell if anyone else was there, and a quiet unease settled deeper into my chest. "You need to leave," I said, taking a small step back without meaning to. "Whatever you think you saw, you are wrong." And for a moment I thought maybe he would argue, maybe he would push, but instead he tilted his head slightly, studying me again, like he was comparing what I said to something only he could see, and then his gaze dropped to the necklace once more, and I felt the shift immediately. The same tension from before, but sharper now, closer. "That piece was custom-made," he said, not raising his voice, not accusing, just stating something that sounded like fact. "There are not 2 of them." And my heart skipped, not because I believed him, but because of the certainty in his voice. The way he said it, like he had lived with that truth for years, like It had been part of his world long before I ever stepped into it, and I forced myself to shake my head, to hold on to the version of reality I understood. Then maybe you are mistaken, I said. But even as I spoke, I knew it sounded weak, and he noticed too. I saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened just enough to betray something beneath the control. I am not mistaken, he said quietly. And then he took one step closer, closing part of the distance between us. Without rushing, without force, but enough to make my breath catch. So I am going to ask you one more time, he continued, and there was something different. Now, something that was not just authority, but something closer to urgency, something personal. Who gave it to you? And the question landed harder this time, not because it was new, but because I could feel what sat behind it, something unresolved, something unfinished, and for a brief second my mind flickered, not a full memory, not clear, just a feeling, a fragment of something I had never been able to place. Something tied to that necklace in a way I had always ignored because it was easier that way, safer that way, and my fingers loosened slightly against the chain before I realized what I was doing, pulling my hand back like I had been caught. It does not matter, I said, my voice softer now, less certain than before, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because his expression changed, not into anger, not into frustration, but into something far more dangerous, recognition. Like a piece of a puzzle had just moved into place, and he looked at me differently. Not like a stranger wearing something that belonged to someone else, but like someone connected to it in a way he had not considered until now. It matters more than you think, he said, almost to himself, and the quiet certainty in his voice made my chest tighten, because I realized then that this was no longer just about proving him wrong. It was about something I did not fully understand yet, something that had already started to unravel, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The way he said that stayed with me longer than it should have. Long after the street went quiet again, and he finally stepped back, giving me just enough space to breathe, but not enough to feel safe. And for a moment neither of us moved, the distance between us filled with something unspoken, something fragile that felt like it could break if either of us said the wrong thing. And I realized then that this was no longer about control or intimidation. This was about something he had lost and was not ready to lose again. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he would not stop. You are making a mistake, I said, softer this time, not as a challenge, but almost as a warning, though I was not sure if I was trying to warn him or myself. And his gaze held mine for a second longer before he reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out a small object that caught the dim light. And when he opened his hand, I saw it. A photograph. Slightly worn at the edges like it had been carried more often than it should have been, and he did not hand it to me right away. He just looked at it for a second, his expression shifting in a way I could not fully read, before he finally extended it toward me. Look, he said, and there was no command in his voice this time. Just something quieter, something almost careful, and I hesitated before taking it, my fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, the contact sending a strange, unexplainable tension through me that I quickly ignored as I focused on the image. And the moment I saw her, everything inside me stilled, because the woman in the photograph looked nothing like me, and yet something about her felt familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. She had dark hair, softer features, a kind smile that seemed frozen in time, and around her neck was the same necklace, the exact same one, resting against her skin like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And I felt my grip on the photograph tighten slightly, as a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. Not a memory, not something I could place. Just a feeling, like I had seen this before somewhere I could not reach. She was my wife, he said quietly, and I could hear it now. The truth beneath the control, the weight of something that had never been resolved. And I swallowed, forcing myself to hand the photograph back, even though part of me wanted to keep looking, to understand why my chest felt so tight. I am sorry, I said, because it was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt appropriate, but it was not enough. I could see that immediately in the way his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in frustration, like sympathy was the one thing he did not want from me. Do not apologize, he replied, taking the photograph back and slipping it into his pocket. With a careful motion that felt practiced, just tell me the truth. And there it was again, that question, heavier now, more urgent, more personal, and I opened my mouth to answer, to say something, anything that would end this. But the words did not come, because the truth was not something I could easily give, not when I did not fully understand it myself. Not when the only thing I had was a lifetime of half answers and missing pieces, and the silence stretched too long, long enough for him to see it, to recognize that this was not just refusal, this was something else, something deeper, and his expression shifted again, softer now, not in a way that made him less dangerous, but in a way that made him more certain, more focused. You do not know, do you? He said quietly, and the words landed with a weight I could not ignore, because he was right. I did not know, not really. Not beyond the fragments I had always pushed aside, the questions I had never asked, the details that never quite added up, and for the first time since this began, fear settled into something different, something colder, because I realized that whatever this was, whatever truth he was chasing, it was not just his past that was about to change, it was mine too. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt full, like something was pressing in from all sides, waiting for me to understand it, to catch up to something he had already seen, and I hated how right he sounded, how easily he had stepped into the spaces I had spent years avoiding, because not knowing had always been easier, safer, something I could live with. But now it felt like a crack had formed, and I could not pretend it was not there anymore. I told you everything I know, I said, but the words felt weak even to me, like they were built on something unstable, and he did not argue, did not push back the way I expected. Instead, he studied me again, quieter this time, like he was looking past the surface, past the answers, searching for something deeper, and that made it worse, because I realized he was not trying to force the truth out of me. He was trying to find it himself. Then start from the beginning, he said finally, his voice calm, steady, and that simple request unsettled me more than any demand could have, because beginnings were never simple, not for me, not when mine felt like it had been written in pieces I never fully received, and I hesitated, my mind scrambling through memories that never quite lined up, childhood images that felt more like fragments than a complete story, and I exhaled slowly, trying to organize something that had never been clear. I have had this necklace as long as I can remember. I began, my voice quieter now, more uncertain. I grew up in foster care, moved around a lot, different homes, different names on paperwork that never stayed long enough to matter, and I paused, the familiar discomfort settling in as I said it out loud, because it always felt like I was describing someone else's life instead of my own. One of the women who took care of me said I came with it. I added, my fingers brushing the chain again. Almost automatically, she said it was the only thing I had when I was dropped off, and as I spoke, something shifted in his expression, subtle but noticeable, like each word was fitting into something he had already suspected, and that made my chest tighten, because it meant this was not random, this was not coincidence. No records, he asked, and I shook my head. Nothing that made sense, I replied. Just gaps, missing details, things that never added up enough for anyone to question them. And for the first time since this started, he looked away, just briefly, his gaze drifting toward the street like he was piecing something together in real time. And when he looked back at me, there was something different in his eyes, not just focus, but certainty. There was an accident, he said slowly, like he was choosing each word carefully. Years ago, my wife disappeared after it. No body, no closure, just gone. And the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it did not sound like a memory that had faded. It sounded like something that had been paused, left unfinished, and I shook my head instinctively. That does not mean anything, I said, but my voice lacked conviction, because even I could hear the connection forming, could feel it building in a way I did not understand yet. And he stepped closer again, not threatening, not forcing, just closing the distance enough that I could not ignore him. It means everything, he said quietly, and the certainty in his voice made something in me falter, because for the first time I could not dismiss it, could not push it aside as coincidence. Not when the pieces were starting to align in ways that felt too precise, too deliberate, and I took a small step back, my breath catching as a strange unease settled deeper into my chest, because I realized this was no longer just about answering his questions, it was about confronting something I had avoided my entire life, something that might change everything I thought I knew about where I came from. And as the silence stretched between us again, heavier now, filled with possibilities I was not ready to face, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever truth was waiting on the other side of this, it was not going to let me walk away unchanged. The way he said it did not leave room for doubt, not in his voice, not in his expression, and that certainty unsettled me more than anything else because it felt like he was already standing at the end of a story I had not even begun to understand, and I was still trying to decide if I should even take the first step. "You are asking me to believe something that does not make sense," I said, my voice quieter now, less defensive but more fragile, like I was holding onto the last version of reality that still felt familiar. And he did not interrupt, did not dismiss it. He just watched me, patient in a way that felt deliberate, like he knew pushing would only make me retreat, and that patience made it harder to resist, not easier, because it left space for the questions I had avoided for years to finally surface. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly, and the shift in topic caught me off guard. 23. I answered after a second, and he nodded slightly, like that confirmed something for him, something he had already been calculating. "And you said you have had that necklace your whole life," he continued, more to himself than to me, and I could see it happening, the way he was connecting pieces I did not even know existed. And I shook my head again, not because I had an answer, but because I did not want to follow where his logic was leading. "People lose things," I said, trying to anchor the situation back to something simple, something ordinary. "Things get copied, replaced. It does not mean anything." And for the first time, something almost like frustration flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable, not directed at me, but at the idea that this could be dismissed so easily. "It was not lost," he said quietly, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it sounded like a truth he had repeated to himself for years, something he refused to let go of no matter what anyone else believed. And before I could respond, he reached into his pocket again, slower this time, more deliberate, and pulled out something else, not a photograph, not something worn or fragile, but a small folded document, aged but carefully preserved, and he held it out to me without speaking, and I hesitated before taking it, unfolding it carefully, my hands unsteady as I read the first few lines, official language, dates, names, and then I saw it, a name that made my breath catch without understanding why, not fully, not yet, but enough to make my chest feel tight. "That is the report from the night she disappeared," he said, his voice steady, controlled. But underneath it there was something else, something unresolved. "They said there was no child." And the words settled into me slowly, like they needed time to take shape, to mean something beyond what I first understood, and I looked up at him, confusion mixing with something colder, something that felt like the edge of a realization I was not ready for. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked, but even as I said it, I felt it, that quiet shift again, that sense that I was already part of something bigger than I had known, and he held my gaze for a long second before answering. "Because if they were wrong," he said quietly, "then everything they told me was wrong." And the weight of that possibility settled between us, heavy, undeniable, and for the first time I felt something beyond fear, something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken for a different reason. Because if what he was suggesting was true, if there was even a chance that the past had been rewritten or hidden or misunderstood, then this was not just his story unraveling. It was mine too. And I realized then that I could not walk away from this. Not anymore. Not when the answers I had never searched for were suddenly standing right in front of me, waiting to be uncovered. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it should have, like the weight of it had nothing to do with ink or age, but with what it implied. And I could not stop staring at the name printed there, tracing the letters in my mind as if they would suddenly rearrange into something that made sense, something familiar. But they did not. They just stayed there, quiet and unyielding, and the longer I looked the more that strange feeling returned. That pull I could not explain, like standing in a place I had never been but somehow recognized. And I swallowed hard, folding the document slowly, carefully, like if I moved too fast it would all fall apart. "This does not prove anything," I said, but the certainty I had before was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, and he noticed. I saw it in the way his posture shifted, not closer, not farther, just steadier, like he had been waiting for this moment, for the crack to finally appear, No, he agreed quietly. It does not. And for a second I was caught off guard, because I expected him to argue, to insist, but instead he let the silence settle again. Let the truth sit there between us without forcing it. And somehow that made it harder to ignore, not easier, because now the questions were mine, not his, and they would not stop forming no matter how much I tried to push them away. Then what are you saying? I asked, my voice softer now, less defensive, more uncertain, and he took a slow breath before answering, like, even he was choosing his words more carefully now. I am saying there are pieces missing, he said, his gaze steady on mine. And you might be one of them. And the way he said it did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a realization, something he had arrived at reluctantly but could not ignore, and I shook my head again, instinctively, because it was too much, too sudden, too impossible. I am not part of your past, I said quickly. I would know. But even as I said it, something inside me hesitated, because knowing had never been simple for me, not when so much of my life had been built on gaps and guesses, and he seemed to catch that hesitation immediately, his expression softening just slightly, not in a way that made him less intense, but in a way that made him more certain. Would you? He asked quietly, and the question lingered, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to dismiss, because I did not have an answer, not one I trusted, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time, filled with thoughts I could not organize fast enough, until finally I looked down at the necklace again, really. Looked at it, at the way it rested against my skin, at the small details I had never questioned before, the tiny engraving on the clasp, the way the metal had aged in a way that felt deliberate, not worn down by time, but shaped by it. And for the first time I wondered not where I got it, but who had chosen it, who had placed it around my neck and decided it belonged to me. And that question hit harder than anything he had said, because it was mine, not his, and I felt my breath catch his eye. Lifted my hand slowly, tracing the edge of the pendant like I was trying to feel something hidden beneath it, something I had missed all these years. And when I looked back up at him, something had changed, not just in him, but in me, because the certainty I had been clinging to was no longer there, replaced by something quieter but far more dangerous, doubt. If you are right, I said slowly, the words forming before I could stop them. Then someone lied, and his gaze sharpened at that, not in surprise, but in recognition, like I had finally stepped into the same line of thought he had been standing in since the beginning. Yes, he said, his voice low, steady. Someone did. And the weight of that truth settled between us, heavier than anything before it, because it meant this was not just about finding answers. It was about uncovering something that had been hidden on purpose, something that had stayed buried for years for a reason. And as the quiet stretched around us again, I realized that whatever we were about to find, it was not going to be simple. It was not going to be easy, and it was definitely not going to let either of us walk away the same. The word lingered between us longer than it should have. Lied. It echoed in my head like something I had always known, but never dared to say out loud. And once it was there, I could not push it back, could not pretend it did not fit too neatly into the empty spaces of my past, the missing records, the unanswered questions, the way every explanation I had ever been given felt incomplete if I looked at it too closely. And I felt my grip tighten slightly around the pendant, like it might slip away if I let go, like it was the only thing tethering me to something real. People do not just disappear and leave everything behind, I said slowly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. I could tell by the way his expression shifted, not into agreement, not into contradiction, but into something more focused, like he had been waiting for me to reach that conclusion on my own. No, he said quietly, they do not. And the certainty in his voice did not feel like arrogance. It felt like experience, like he had spent years turning that same thought over and over until it became something unshakable. And I swallowed, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces I had never tried to connect before. The woman who told me about the necklace, I said, my voice unsteady as I tried to pull the memory into focus. She never said where I came from. Not really, just that I was brought in late, not like the others, like someone did not want questions asked. And even saying it out loud made something in my chest tighten, because I had always accepted it as just another detail in a complicated system. But now it felt deliberate, intentional, like part of something bigger, and his gaze sharpened immediately. "Do you remember her name?" he asked, and I hesitated, closing my eyes for a second as I reached back into a part of my memory I rarely touched. "Margaret," I said finally. "Margaret Ellis. She worked at one of the homes in Queens. I was there when I was maybe 5 or 6. And the moment the words left my mouth, I saw the shift in him, subtle but immediate, like something had just aligned in a way he had not expected, and that made my pulse quicken, because it meant this was real, not just speculation, not just coincidence. "Ellis," he repeated quietly, like the name meant something to him, like it carried weight beyond what I understood, and he took a step back this time, not away from me, but away from the moment, his gaze drifting slightly as if he was seeing something else entirely, something from years ago that was suddenly relevant again. "There was a report," he said slowly, almost to himself, "a witness who disappeared before giving a full statement." And when he looked back at me, the intensity in his eyes had changed again, no longer just searching, but certain, like the last piece of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. "I think she knew something," he continued, his voice steadier now, more grounded in something concrete. "And I think she made sure you were not found." And the words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they made a kind of sense I could not ignore anymore, a pattern forming where before there had only been fragments, and I felt my breath catch as the realization settled deeper, colder, because if that was true, if someone had gone out of their way to hide me, to place me somewhere I would not be traced, then this was never random, never accidental, it was planned, and I looked down at the necklace again, at the way it rested so naturally against me, like it had always been part of me, and for the first time I wondered if it had been left as a clue or a mistake, something meant to stay hidden or something that was never supposed to be found. And when I looked back up at him, the question that formed was not the one I expected. It was not about his past or his wife or the story he had been chasing for years. It was about mine, about the part of it that had always been just out of reach. "If someone hid me," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper now, "then what were they hiding me from?" And the silence that followed felt different this time, heavier, sharper, because for the first time neither of us had an answer, only the same realization that whatever truth we were uncovering, it was not just about loss or memory. It was about something that had been kept in the dark on purpose, something that was only now beginning to surface, and neither of us was ready for what that might mean. The question stayed there, hanging between us, heavier than anything that had come before it, because it was no longer about what we knew. It was about what we did not, and that felt far more dangerous, far more real, and I could see it in his eyes that he understood that too, that this was no longer a puzzle he could solve with patience and control. This was something that had been buried deliberately, something that had survived by staying hidden, and uncovering it would not be simple, would not be clean. "I do not know," he said finally, and it was the first time he had admitted uncertainty, not weakness, but honesty, and somehow that made everything feel more real, not less, because if someone like him did not have the answer, then whatever truth we were standing on the edge of was deeper than either of us expected, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself as the pieces continued to shift in my mind. Margaret Ellis, the necklace, the missing records, his wife who had vanished without closure. None of it felt separate anymore. It felt connected in ways I could not ignore, and I looked down at the pendant again, really looked this time, tracing the faint engraving with my thumb, and for the first time I noticed something I had missed before, something so small it could have gone unnoticed forever, a set of initials, delicate, nearly worn smooth with time, but still there, still intentional. And my breath caught as I tilted it slightly toward the streetlight, reading them again to be sure I was not imagining it. A and E, I whispered, the letters barely audible, but they landed between us with unmistakable weight, and when I looked up at him, his expression had changed completely, not shock, not confusion, but recognition so immediate it felt like the air shifted around us. "Adrian and Elena," he said quietly, the words forming without hesitation, like they had always been there waiting to be spoken, and something inside me stilled at the sound of that second name, Elena, because it did not feel unfamiliar. It did not feel like something new. It felt like something I had forgotten, something that had been just out of reach for as long as I could remember, and for a second the world around me faded, The street, the car, the quiet hum of the city, all of it slipping into the background as that name echoed in my mind, not as a stranger's name, but as something closer, something that belonged, and I felt my grip on the necklace loosen slightly as my thoughts raced, trying to catch up to a realization that refused to fully form. That is not my name, I said instinctively, but the words lacked conviction, because even as I said them, something inside me resisted, something that did not want to let them be true, and he stepped closer again, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore him. Maybe it was, he said softly, and there was no demand in his voice, no pressure. Just a simple statement that felt heavier than anything else he had said, and I shook my head again, but slower this time, less certain, because the line between what I knew and what I believed was starting to blur. You are asking me to believe that everything I have been told is wrong, I said, and he held my gaze without hesitation. I am asking you to consider that it might be incomplete, he replied, and the difference between those two things settled into me slowly, because incomplete meant there was more, not that everything was false, and that thought changed something, shifted something, made the truth feel less like it was being taken from me and more like it was waiting to be found. And the silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of answers just out of reach, and I realized then that I had already crossed a line I could not step back from. Because whether I wanted to or not, I needed to know, not just for him, not just for his past, but for mine. And as I lifted my hand to the necklace one more time, feeling its weight against my skin, I understood something with a clarity that both grounded and unsettled me. Some truths are not lost. They are hidden, waiting for the moment when someone is finally ready to see them.